So, here we are in Photoshop CS2's Camera Raw interface. It may not be the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, but you'll soon learn to love it for all the extra quality it's going to give your pictures. If you have another version of Photoshop, CS or CS3 for example, the interface will look a little different. Don't worry though, its functions are remarkably similar, or identical in most cases. In this lesson, we'll provide an introduction to the Camera Raw interface, and make a simple RAW conversion of this image, priory.dng. And as we work through the various functions and settings, you'll discover what a powerful and versatile tool RAW can be. At first glance, the Camera Raw interface may look complicated, but it's actually no more difficult to operate than many of Photoshop's other palettes. On the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see your chosen RAW file, while on the right-hand side are a selection of sliders that allow you to control things like white balance, exposure, and saturation. And as we're moving these sliders around, it's important to remember that you're not actually changing the file itself, just how it's converted and opens into Photoshop. That means that the raw data always stays the same. So in theory, you could open the same RAW file a million times and convert it a million different ways. Okay, before we start the conversion process, let's take a look around the Camera Raw interface. Starting up here at the top left, the first thing you'll see is some information about the shot. What camera it was taken on, the file name, and the shooting settings. In this case we've got ISO 200, 1/320th of a second at f11, and we used an 18 to 70mm lens at the wide end. And if any of this information is missing, it's probably because you're using an older lens that's not fully compatible with your camera. Moving down the Camera Raw interface, we find a selection of tools. The first two, the Zoom tool and the Hand tool, operate in exactly the same way as they do in Photoshop. So with the Zoom tool, you can click and drag out the area you want to magnify, or simply keep clicking on the image to enlarge it on screen, which is great for viewing very fine details. And with the Hand tool, we simply click and drag the image around so that we can see different parts of it. And using the Zoom tool, we can actually zoom all the way in to 400%, close enough to see the individual pixels that make up the image. And also, just like in Photoshop, there are keyboard shortcuts that you can use to navigate your way around the picture. Simply hold down Control on the keyboard and press the minus key and you'll zoom out, while holding down the spacebar brings up the Hand tool, and once that appears on screen you can click and drag the picture around. Get used to these shortcut ways of working and it'll really speed up your imaging workflow. But if you want to keep using the magnifying glass, simply have it selected and then hold down Alt on the keyboard and you'll see that the plus sign turns into a minus, and then clicking takes us out to a wider view. Next up is the White Balance tool, and using this we can simply click on any part of the image to set the color temperature. But before we do that, we have to make sure that the preview box is ticked, because if we don't, although all the sliders on the right hand side are changing, we're not seeing what's happening on our actual image. Give the preview box a tick so that we can see what changes are being made, and then what we need to do is find a neutral tone within the image. Click on it and that'll give us a nice accurate white balance. So keep clicking around on these neutral grey areas until you find something that's pleasing. This is a quick and easy way of setting the white balance, but we'll come on to ways in which you can fine-tune it a little bit later. Next up, along the line of tools, is the Color Sampler tool. And what this does is it allows us to click on the image and generate an RGB value for the pixel we've selected. And this is useful for both fine-tuning the white balance and also for keeping tabs on specific parts of the image. For example, down here in this very light area, we've got an RGB rating of red 233, green 215 and blue 194. And by keeping these numbers on screen, we'll be able to keep tabs on that area, allowing us to see how it's affected by the sliders we're using on the right hand side. So as I say, it's just a good way of keeping tabs on certain parts of the shot. Next up, we come to the crop tool and the straighten tool. And while these are useful additions to the camera or interface, in many ways it's easier to use their equivalents within Photoshop. However, we'll just take a quick look at them in case you want to use them in your own conversions. The crop tool works in exactly the same way as it does in Photoshop, and if you use the left mouse button and click and hold it down on the crop tool, you'll be able to select from a list of aspect ratios or create your own. To make a crop, simply click on the image and drag out the marquee. And once you do that, you'll see we get a bounding box around the selected area. From here, we can click on any of these corner handles to resize the crop, and we can also rotate it by holding the mouse outside the corner handle, clicking and dragging. And once again, just like in Photoshop, holding down the Shift key on the keyboard when you drag these handles will constrain the proportions of the cropped area. To get rid of the cropping marquee, just press Escape. And now we'll have a little look at the straighten tool. And this is actually a very handy little bit of kit, especially if you've got an image a bit like this, an architectural shot, where we can see that one of the main verticals is a little bit on the slant. And the way you use the straighten tool is by first clicking on the image and then mimicking the slant of the vertical that you want to straighten up. Then release the left mouse button and you'll see that a cropping marquee has appeared based on how the image needs to be cropped so it's straightened up when it appears in Photoshop. As I say, quite a handy tool, but we're going to dispense with it for a moment simply by hitting Escape again. Next to the straighten tool, you'll find options to rotate the image 90 degrees counterclockwise or back in the other direction. Further along the top of the palette, we find the preview box, which of course we've already selected, and next to that we have the shadows and the highlights clipping warning. And what these do is display in either blue for shadows or red for highlights areas of the image that have either become totally burnt out, i.e. white, or totally blocked out in shadow, i.e. black. In both cases you'll be losing detail, so it's handy to turn them on as a warning that we're not pushing the conversion too far in either direction. And when I selected those options, you may have seen a few blue areas creep into the preview image, just there in the trees and on the columns on the front of the priory, showing that those areas are a perfect black. We can't see very many highlight clipping warnings at the moment, those shown in red, but as we move through this tutorial I'll show you times when they're likely to appear. Next up is the histogram, very much like you'd find in the levels palette or on the LCD screen on the back of your camera. And essentially the histogram is a graphical display of how many light and how many dark pixels there are in the image. Just like the preview shot on the left, this will change as we work through the sliders. For most shots, you'll be looking to generate an image with a histogram that's not too bunched up at either end. Like clipping warnings, this is a sign that you're losing detail in the shadows or the highlights. And in most cases, that's to be avoided. Finally, before we start converting the raw file, let's take a look at the options at the bottom of the palette. If you can't see them, just click on the Show Workflow Options button and you can toggle them on and off. And in this area you'll find choices on what color space to work in. Here we've chosen Adobe RGB 1998, what size the image will appear when it's loaded into Photoshop. In here we can either stay with the native resolution of the camera, or we can decrease or increase the image size in much the same way as you would using the image size dialog box in Photoshop. And we can also change the resolution and whether it's being displayed in pixels per inch or pixels per centimeter. There's also an option to control bit depth, choosing between 8 bits per channel and 16 bits. And essentially, this is all about quality. So while 8-bit gives you 256 possible different tones for each red, green and blue value that goes to make up a single pixel, 16-bit will give you 4096 possible tones for each channel. Of course, the advantage of having all these extra tones is that it gives you extra subtlety in the way that detail is displayed. But there's also a downside, because producing a 16-bit file instead of an 8-bit one produces an image that takes up much more memory on your computer. There are other limitations too, depending on the version of Photoshop that you're using, so you may not be able to use certain features within Photoshop when using a 16-bit file. You also won't be able to save it as a JPEG. For the most part, and to produce perfectly high quality images, the best option is to leave it on 8 bits per channel, because even if you're editing in 16-bit, as soon as you come to print it out, you'll go back to 8-bit quality. So until technology catches up with this option, it's best to leave it like that. Just hang on to your original RAW files, even after you've converted them to JPEGs or TIFFs, and you'll have plenty of high quality options for the future. Okay, that's enough palette geography, let's get on with the good stuff. The actual RAW conversion process. The first thing to do when you load a RAW file into Adobe Camera Raw is make sure that next to Settings you pick Camera Raw Defaults. And then, further down the list, make sure that all these auto settings are unticked. And once we do that, we're really looking at the pure raw data, just as it hit the camera sensor, with no enhancements or automatic adjustments made. From this point on, every change that we make to the image is up to us. Not Photoshop, not your camera, it's all down to you as the photographer. Underneath the Settings menu, you'll find a selection of tabs, and we'll be starting with the Adjust tab. So if you don't have that on screen, give it a click. And the first option within the Adjust tab is White Balance. Now, as we saw before, we can either select the white balance by using the White Balance tool and clicking on the image, but we can also control it by clicking in this drop-down menu and selecting options very much like those you'd find on your camera. The great thing about this is, even if you selected the wrong white balance at the time of shooting, you'll be able to change it afterwards, so no more nasty blue landscapes or orange portraits, it's all fixable in RAW. For a shot like this, which was taken on a nice sunny day, the best option to choose is daylight, and this gives us a colour temperature value of 5500 degrees Kelvin. But if we want to fine-tune that setting, all we need to do is click on the slider and either drag it to the right to warm it up, or to the left to cool it down. I'm going to move this up to 6500 degrees Kelvin, and that's just warming up the shot and giving it a bit more of a nice late afternoon sun look. Underneath the temperature slider, you'll find the tint option, and this is useful for correcting any minor colour casts that might be in your shot. We drag it around in just the same way as the other sliders. So down here on the left hand side we get a green colouring, and over on the right we're turning the shot more of a magenta colour. I'm just going to leave this at around +5. And generally, as you saw as I was moving the slider around, it's best not to push the tint too far unless you're after a particularly unusual effect. Further down the palette we come to the exposure slider, probably one of the most powerful and useful options in the whole of Adobe Camera Raw, because simply by clicking on the slider we can change the overall exposure of the image, just like you'd get if you were changing the exposure settings on the camera. So pulling the slider to the right is rather like letting more light into your camera, and pushing it to the left is the opposite. We're letting less light in and getting a darker image. But of course, instead of changing the shutter speed or aperture at the time of shooting, which would also give us slightly different creative effects, The exposure slider is really a little bit more about sensitivity. So we're just being able to use a little bit less or a little bit more of the light that was in the original scene. And this is amazingly handy if you've under or overexposed the original shot. If I set it back to 0 here, you'll see that our original picture was just a little bit dark and dim. But just by moving it to +1, we get a much brighter and more pleasing image. And in many ways, the exposure slider is a bit like the white point slider in the levels palette within Photoshop. Though of course with RAW, we have much more latitude, bringing back detail in shadows and highlights that would be impossible with a fixed file in Photoshop. And so by continuing to move the exposure slider to the right, we're carrying on brightening the image until we start seeing these red highlight clipping warnings appear. That means we've gone too far. And if you look at the histogram, you'll see that on the right hand side the graph has met the end. So we just need to push that back until all of those red dots disappear, bringing it back down to about plus 1.4 stops. Of course it depends on the individual image how far you need to push or pull the exposure slider to get a nice balanced shot. But for this one, plus 1.4 stops should be just about fine. So really the exposure slider is incredibly useful, but there are some things you need to watch for. The first of them is not to push it too far. Anything beyond about 3 stops either way is likely to start looking a little bit ropey. You're likely to get some rather unnatural looking colour shifts and banding where the tones should be nice and smooth, and you're also likely to get a lot of rather unsightly looking digital noise in the shadows. Also, remember that the exposure slider is applied globally to the entire image. So even if, for instance, you bring a bright sky back into register, you'll also be darkening a lot of shadow areas. A great way around this is to produce 2 separate RAW conversions of the same image, but we'll be coming onto that in a later lesson. And a really handy thing to do when you're altering the exposure is just to hold down Alt on the keyboard as you move the slider. And as I do that, you'll see we get a much clearer preview of the areas that are beginning to clip. Release the Alt key and you'll see it's all looking a bit ugly. Moving down the list again, we come to the Shadows slider. And again, this works very much like the black point slider in Photoshop's Levels palette. But just like the exposure slider, we have a lot more control. Taking the initial point as the image was captured, we can move the slider to the left and reduce a lot of the black that's in those shadow areas, bringing back the detail. And there you'll have seen a lot of those blue shadow clipping warnings disappear. Of course, just like the exposure slider, it's possible to get some pretty extreme effects when using the shadows slider, making lots of parts of the image really dark. And again, holding down the Alt key gives us a clearer preview of which areas are being blocked out. We're going to leave the shadows slider at 2, which is just going to give us a little bit of definition in the trees and also add some nice dark shadows to the columns on the front of the building. Next up is the brightness slider, and this, as its name suggests, adjusts the overall image brightness. Shifting it around won't over or underexpose the image quite as readily as the exposure and shadow sliders, but you do still need to be careful. There you can see pushing up to the top end has us bleaching out the front of the building. So subtlety is the order of the day, and we're just going to set this a little higher than the default value at 60. The last 2 sliders on the Adjust tab, Contrast and Saturation, are both pretty similar to the options found in Photoshop. Moving the Contrast slider gives more bias to the quarter and the 3/4 tones, so all of those mid-tones in the middle of the histogram are getting pushed either to the left of the chart or to the right. Take a look at the histogram there and you can see it happening. The dark pixels are getting darker and the light ones are getting lighter. And again, we just need to watch how far we push the contrast slider, because there at the top end you can see we're getting some of those red highlight clipping warnings, and overall it's just making the image look a bit posterized and unnatural. And if we push it the other way, you'll see we get a lot more midtones and the whole image starts to look a bit grey. Settling on something around plus 20, plus 25 or so will give us a little bit more bite in the shot, but it doesn't overcook things. And similarly, we're just going to increase the saturation slider to about plus 10, making all those colours just a touch more vibrant. But of course, if we were so inclined, we could push it all the way up until things get really quite gaudy, or take the saturation slider all the way to the left, where we lose all of the colour in the image. Just a minor tweak of plus 10 or so will be okay for us here. Now let's move on to the Detail tab, so just come up to here next to Adjust and give that a click. In here we have fewer options than the Adjust tab, just Sharpness, Luminance Smoothing and Colour Noise Reduction. The Sharpness slider has a default setting of 25, and although using this can add a little more clarity to your images, it's actually best to turn it off during your conversion. The reason for this is that the sharpness is applied globally to the image, so we're getting sharpness all over the shot. A much better method is to finish the conversion, take the shot into Photoshop, and then simply sharpen the areas you want to. Again, there'll be some advice on how to do that later on. Next up, we have luminance smoothing. And to show you how that works, I'm just going to zoom right in on the image to about 200. In fact, let's go into 300%. Now, luminance smoothing is very handy for disguising digital noise, the lumpy, grainy effect you get when using high ISOs. In this shot, we've used a low ISO of 200, so noise isn't very apparent. And basically, what the luminance smoothing does is it applies some softness to the shot, which disguises the grain. And if I take it right up to 100, you may be able to see that we get a little softening effect. It's quite difficult to see, and that's why you need to be zoomed in a long way. Remember though, if you are trying to deal with digital noise by using luminance smoothing, you will have to apply some sharpness afterwards. Coming back out to a full view, I'm just going to zoom in on some of this shady brickwork so that we can have a look at the next option, the Colour Noise Reduction slider. Now once again, it may be a little bit difficult to see, but if I take this all the way down to 0, you'll find that we're seeing a bit of red, green and blue interference. This is much more common when shooting long exposures and using high ISOs, so it doesn't really apply to this image, although we will be leaving it at the default setting of 25 just to tone down any interference that was there. The next option we come to in our conversion is the Lens tab, and this is just used to correct some common lens defects, those that produce fringing around high contrast areas, for instance where a rooftop meets a bright sky. And then there's vignetting, which deals with the fall off of light at the edge of an image, again caused by the specific optic you're using. Just like all the other sliders in the camera raw interface, we control these by pushing them to the left or the right. There's not a lot of chromatic aberration in this shot, so we won't be able to see how the sliders are working. But you'll find a dedicated video lesson on correcting these kind of defects later on. The next tab that we come to is the Curve tab. And this is a great way of controlling contrast in your shot. It's almost identical to the Curves palette in Photoshop. But we also have a little preset box here where we can choose Linear, which is no contrast adjustment, Medium contrast, which just gives a little kick to the highlights and the shadows, and then we have Strong contrast, which is a slightly more extreme effect. there you will have seen the curve on the graph changing its shape between the two, and then of course, just as in Photoshop, we can click and drag the curve around, affecting the contrast as we wish. But like some of the other options within the camera or interface, this is really something that's best left to your image editing within Photoshop, because again, all of the adjustments are global, meaning that you can't add contrast to the trees in particular, the foreground, or indeed the sky. In this case, we're just going to leave the curve set to medium contrast, which, as I said, just lightens the highlights a touch, darkens the shadows, and gives us a little bit more bite in the picture. The final tab is called Calibrate, and in here we can make fine adjustments to the overall color balance of the image. Just changing the shadow tint from green at this end to magenta at the other, which just gives us a slight warming effect. And then we can individually adjust the hue and saturation of the red, green and blue channels that make up the image. This can be really handy for correcting color shifts in your images and also to generate some fantastic creative effects. And there's a whole video about it later on. But we've nearly come to the end of our conversion now, so it's time to look at how we record the options we've chosen. The easiest and most simple way to finish the conversion is just to press open, which will simply open up the shot into Photoshop. But we also have the option to save the changes we've made just by clicking on this button at the bottom of the palette. This will bring up a dialog box wherein we choose where to save the file, what to call it, and what format to save it in. So in this way we can save multiple conversions of the same RAW file. But that is pretty much the end of our basic RAW conversion. We've taken a pretty flat, underexposed shot and turned it into something really pleasing, just by working through this simple set of sliders on the right hand side of the screen. So make sure you give it a go with your own RAW files, and you'll find out how useful and how powerful it really is.